The conversation around nuclear conflict tends to fixate on the detonation itself. Analysts present concentric rings of destruction overlaid on city grids, color-coded by severity, measuring everything from thermal radiation exposure to overpressure thresholds. Governments hold briefings. Media outlets run segments. The public absorbs the information, processes a momentary unease, and returns to daily routines. What almost never receives equivalent attention is the question of what happens to the geographies outside those rings, the regions where the blast itself is not the primary threat. Because for the vast majority of the population, surviving the initial exchange is not the challenge. The challenge is surviving what comes afterward, and that problem operates on an entirely different set of variables than the ones most threat assessments prioritize. The atmospheric consequences of a large-scale nuclear exchange are not speculative. They are grounded in established physics, corroborated by paleoclimatic data, and repeatedly validated through peer-reviewed computational climate modeling. When thermonuclear warheads detonate above urban centers, the resulting firestorms do not merely level structures. They generate immense volumes of superheated black carbon particulate that ascends rapidly into the stratosphere, a layer of the atmosphere where it is not subject to washout by rain. Within a matter of weeks, this soot disperses globally, forming a persistent veil that significantly reduces the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. The downstream effects are predictable and severe. Global mean surface temperatures decline by an estimated 4 to 16 degrees Celsius depending on the scale of the exchange and the volume of soot injected. Growing seasons shorten drastically or disappear entirely across major agricultural belts. Precipitation patterns shift in ways that compound the temperature problem, reducing rainfall in some of the world's most productive farming regions while producing abnormal weather events in others. Agricultural output collapses across most of the planet's arable regions, and it does so on a timeline that dramatically outpaces any government's logistical capacity to respond. There are no strategic grain reserves on Earth sufficient to bridge a 2-year gap in global food production. None. The system was never designed for that contingency, because the system was designed on the assumption that global agriculture would never simultaneously fail. Research published in Nature Food examined a limited exchange scenario involving fewer than 100 warheads, a regional conflict between India and Pakistan that would not directly involve the United States, and projected that the resulting atmospheric disruption would place approximately 5 billion people at risk of famine within 24 months. 5 billion individuals endangered by a conflict most citizens of the developed world would struggle to locate geographically. Consider for a moment what the physical environment actually looks like under these conditions. There is no cinematic orange glow on the horizon. Instead, a dense, featureless gray overcast settles across the sky and remains there, day after day, week after week. The sun, when visible at all, appears as a diffuse, pale disk, offering minimal warmth. Midsummer temperatures behave like late autumn. Agricultural fields that should be at peak productivity sit underdeveloped, their yields reduced to fractions of normal output. Supply chains, designed with minimal redundancy and calibrated for just-in-time delivery, cease to function within weeks. And then the secondary consequences begin cascading. Mass displacement, resource conflict, institutional disintegration, and the systematic failure of every interconnected system that modern life depends upon. This is not a temporary emergency. Atmospheric modeling consistently indicates a disruption window of 2 to 5 years before meaningful climatic recovery begins, and full agricultural normalization extends well beyond that. The states and regions identified in this assessment are not here because they escape consequences entirely. No location on Earth does. They are here because their geographic, hydrological, agricultural, and demographic characteristics provide a measurable advantage in sustaining human life through that window of maximum vulnerability. The variables that determine survivability under these conditions are specific: reliable access to uncontaminated freshwater, productive soil, capable of supporting cultivation under degraded climatic conditions, low population density relative to local carrying capacity, pre-existing community knowledge of low-technology food production and preservation, and sufficient geographic distance from primary nuclear targets and likely fallout corridors. Each state on this list scores meaningfully well across multiple categories simultaneously. That convergence is what matters. Montana. The initial reaction to Montana as a survival geography is typically skepticism. It is already one of the coldest states in the continental United States. Adding nuclear winter cooling to that baseline seems counterproductive. That intuition, while understandable, reflects a fundamental misreading of how post-exchange survival dynamics actually operate. Montana does contain high-priority military targets. Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls and the extensive missile silo fields along the Northern Highline Corridor are present on every credible strategic targeting list. Anyone presenting Montana as entirely free from direct nuclear risk is either uninformed or misleading their audience. However, Montana encompasses over 147,000 square miles. The prevailing atmospheric circulation patterns carry fallout predominantly eastward, across the northern Great Plains. Communities positioned in the Bitterroot Valley, the Flathead Lake watershed, and portions of the western mountain corridors occupy a fundamentally different risk profile than the state's eastern and north-central regions. The critical insight about Montana is not that it avoids cold. It is that its entire agricultural and social infrastructure was built to operate within extreme cold as a permanent condition. A grain producer operating outside Missoula, who routinely stores 6 months of harvested wheat, is not engaging in survivalist behavior. That is standard operational practice for managing a climate where productive seasons are brief and winters are prolonged. That same producer already heats with locally sourced wood, already plans cultivation around unpredictable late-season frost events, and already operates without meaningful dependence on the rapid delivery logistics networks that sustain urban populations. When nuclear winter imposes additional cooling, this individual faces an intensified version of a problem already deeply familiar, not an entirely novel crisis requiring improvised responses. That distinction between escalated hardship and unprecedented catastrophe is operationally decisive. Communities adapted to the former reorganize and endure. Communities confronting the latter frequently do not. Montana's hydrological assets reinforce this advantage considerably. The Missouri River headwaters and the Flathead Lake system constitute substantial freshwater reserves situated in terrain that provides meaningful natural protection against contamination pathways. Flathead Lake is the largest natural freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, and its watershed benefits from the filtration effect of mountain runoff passing through glacial geology before reaching populated areas. Clean water access is the non-negotiable foundation of post-collapse survival. Without it, food production, medical care, and basic sanitation all become impossible simultaneously. Montana provides it reliably, in volume, and in locations where natural topography offers a degree of protection that flat, open terrain simply cannot. There is also a social dimension worth noting. Western Montana communities tend to be characterized by high rates of firearms ownership, hunting competence, and wildlife management knowledge. In a scenario where domesticated livestock herds may be insufficient and conventional protein supply chains have ceased, the capacity to supplement food production through organized hunting of the state's substantial elk, deer, and moose populations represents a meaningful caloric buffer. This is not abstract. It is a practice skill set distributed broadly across the population in a way that distinguishes Montana from states where hunting is a marginal activity rather than a cultural norm. If this analysis is useful to you, take a moment to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. It helps more people find this information when they need it. Idaho. The relevance of Idaho to this assessment has nothing to do with its urban centers. Boise and the Treasure Valley Corridor represent the same category of vulnerability that characterizes any moderately dense population center in a post-exchange environment. Too many people, too little local food production capacity, and excessive dependence on external supply networks. Idaho earns its position through the Snake River Plain and a single agricultural product that becomes disproportionately important under nuclear winter conditions: the potato. Idaho currently produces more than 30% of national potato output, and the characteristics of this crop align remarkably well with the specific constraints of a post-exchange growing environment. Potatoes generate more caloric output per unit of cultivated land than nearly any other temperate staple. They tolerate cooler soil temperatures that would severely compromise grain yields. They develop below the soil surface, where they are partially insulated from the erratic atmospheric temperature fluctuations that nuclear winter produces. And they store effectively in simple underground facilities without requiring electrical refrigeration. Under normal circumstances, this agricultural profile attracts little attention. Under conditions where reliable solar radiation can no longer be assumed, it represents a foundational advantage around which regional food security can be organized. The contrast with high-density coastal regions illustrates the point with stark clarity. By day 90 of a post-exchange scenario, communities across the Snake River Plain retain functional knowledge of irrigation management, crop rotation under stress conditions, cold storage logistics, and seasonal food preservation. These capabilities exist as embedded cultural practice, not as recently acquired emergency skills. A metropolitan region of comparable population, lacking agricultural land, local groundwater, and distributed food production knowledge, faces a fundamentally different trajectory, one that deteriorates progressively without a plausible recovery mechanism. Idaho's relatively low population density introduces an additional structural advantage. In any scenario involving systemic institutional failure, the rate at which social order degrades is often more consequential than the absolute severity of the disruption. Communities that experience gradual deterioration retain the organizational capacity to establish local governance, coordinate resource distribution, and develop mutual defense arrangements. Communities subjected to sudden, overwhelming breakdown typically do not, regardless of what physical resources their geography provides. Nebraska, the Great Plains, tend to be dismissed in popular imagination as undifferentiated flatland, agriculturally productive but strategically unremarkable. That assessment would be a critical error in a post-exchange environment. Nebraska sits above the deepest and most hydrologically robust section of the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest subterranean freshwater systems on the planet, extending beneath 8 states. It is important to be precise here. The Ogallala is not an unlimited resource. Decades of intensive agricultural extraction have significantly drawn down its levels in the southern portions, particularly beneath the Texas Panhandle and southwestern Kansas. Overstating its permanence would be irresponsible, but the aquifer beneath Nebraska remains measurably deeper and more resilient than in any other overlying state. In a scenario where municipal water treatment has ceased functioning and surface water sources are unreliable due to contamination or disrupted precipitation patterns, the capacity to access clean groundwater from significant depth represents a survival advantage of the first order. The soil quality compounds this advantage. Nebraska's deep, organically rich, nitrogen-dense topsoil ranks among the most productive agricultural land anywhere on Earth. Industrial-scale farming, dependent on petroleum-based mechanization and synthetic fertilizer inputs, would obviously cease to function in a post-collapse environment. That disruption is a given, but the transition to lower-yield, manually managed cultivation is a qualitatively different undertaking on soil of this caliber, compared to regions characterized by depleted clay substrates, thin topsoil layers, or acidic compositions requiring constant amendment. The foundational growing medium exists. The question reduces to whether sufficient human knowledge and social organization persist to utilize it. And that question has an affirmative answer in numerous Nebraska communities where multi-generational farming practice remains intact. The state's agricultural community also retains a higher-than-average concentration of mechanical repair skills, equipment fabrication knowledge, and the practical engineering competence required to maintain irrigation systems, water pumps, and food processing equipment without access to manufacturer support networks or replacement parts supply chains. These capabilities, often invisible during normal times because they operate behind the scenes of industrial agriculture, become among the most critical human capital assets in a post-collapse environment. A community that can repair a water pump using salvaged materials is a community that can sustain itself indefinitely. A community that cannot is dependent on external support that will not arrive. Nebraska's geographic position also provides a temporal buffer against what would likely be the most destabilizing secondary consequence of a nuclear exchange: mass population displacement from destroyed or uninhabitable coastal urban centers. Tens of millions of people moving outward from the eastern seaboard and the Pacific coast would generate enormous pressure on every community in their path. Nebraska's interior position means that this migration wave arrives later and with diminished intensity relative to states situated closer to those population centers. That delay does not eliminate the challenge, but it provides what is arguably the single most valuable commodity in a collapse scenario: time to prepare. Quick reminder, if you're finding value in this breakdown, a like, comment, or subscribe goes a long way. Now back to the assessment. Minnesota. 10% of the planet's surface freshwater sits along Minnesota's northeastern border in the form of Lake Superior alone. That statistic deserves a moment of deliberate consideration, not as geographic trivia, but as a survival variable of extraordinary magnitude. One state, one body of water, 10% of all accessible surface freshwater on Earth. In a post-exchange world where infrastructure failure has elevated clean water access to the single most critical determinant of community survival, that concentration of resources is almost without parallel. But the dimension of Minnesota's advantage that most analyses overlook is its protein security. specifically through freshwater fishing at scale. This is not a recreational consideration. It is a primary food production system that operates entirely independently of surface agriculture and, crucially, independently of solar radiation levels. Minnesota's approximately 10,000 lakes are predominantly cold, deep, and biologically productive. Walleye, northern pike, and other cold water species do not require warm surface temperatures, do not depend on sunlight-driven photosynthetic food chains in the same direct way that terrestrial agriculture does, and continue to thrive under the precise atmospheric conditions that devastate conventional crop production. When the growing season has been reduced to a fraction of its normal duration, and field agriculture can no longer reliably feed communities, lake-based protein harvesting continues to function. Communities with the infrastructure, knowledge, and social organization to fish at meaningful scale avoid the acute protein deficit that purely agricultural communities would face. Layer additional assets onto this foundation. The Iron Range provides access to metal ore for tool production and repair, a capability whose importance escalates dramatically once manufactured goods supply chains have permanently ceased. The Northwoods offer virtually unlimited fuel wood for heating, through winters that could extend well beyond any historical precedent. The state's established dairy industry embeds deep generational knowledge of animal husbandry that would facilitate the transition from industrial-scale operations to sustainable, lower-yield production methods. There is a further consideration that rarely appears in survival assessments, but carries significant weight in practice: Minnesota's cultural infrastructure of cooperative organization. The state has one of the highest densities of agricultural cooperatives, mutual aid societies, and community-organized institutions in the nation. These structures, often dismissed as quaint holdovers from an earlier economic era, represent precisely the kind of distributed, trust-based organizational framework that replaces formal government services when those services cease to exist. Communities that already know how to pool resources, coordinate labor, and make collective decisions under pressure do not need to invent those capacities during a crisis. They deploy them. Minnesota's survivability profile is not built on a single dominant advantage. It is constructed from multiple independent systems: water, protein, fuel, materials, agricultural knowledge, cooperative social infrastructure, that reinforce one another. That redundancy is precisely what makes a region viable when the interconnected systems of normal civilization have stopped functioning. No single failure cascades into total collapse because no single system bears the entire load. Kansas. The objection to Kansas is immediate and understandable. Whiteman Air Force Base, McConnell Air Force Base, Fort Riley. These are confirmed high-priority targets in any plausible strategic exchange. They would receive strikes. That is not in dispute. However, Kansas covers over 82,000 square miles. The military installations concentrated in the eastern portion of the state do not render the western high plains uninhabitable. Communities situated west of Wichita, and particularly west of Dodge City, occupy a materially different risk category, not free of consequence, but within a range that permits survival and adaptation. Envision a small agricultural community in far western Kansas, 18 months into a nuclear winter scenario. Electrical grid, non-functional. External supply networks, non-existent. The sky maintains its characteristic flat gray, but grain reserves remain in storage. Livestock herds are intact and managed. The community well continues to draw from the Ogallala's western extent. And critically, the accumulated generational knowledge of pre-industrial food production, preservation, seed saving, animal husbandry, and basic medical care has not been lost because it was never abandoned. It persists as living practice in communities whose daily rhythms predate modern infrastructure by multiple generations. This knowledge cannot be acquired after a collapse has already begun. It either exists within a community's active skill set or it does not. Improvisation under crisis conditions is not a substitute for embedded competence. In the agricultural communities of western Kansas, that competence remains present and functional. There is also a dimension of social resilience in these communities that warrants attention. Small agricultural towns in western Kansas operate with informal mutual support networks that have been tested repeatedly by natural disasters, drought cycles, and economic downturns. These communities know what it means to lose a harvest. They know what it means to support a neighbor through a failed season. They have done it, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a recurring feature of life on the high plains. That institutional memory of collective endurance under adversity is a resource that does not appear on any map, but may ultimately prove more consequential than any aquifer or soil classification. A quick like, comment, or subscribe helps this content reach people who are seriously thinking about these questions. Appreciate you being here. Wisconsin contributes one capability to this assessment that no other state can replicate at equivalent scale, and it initially sounds incongruous in a nuclear survival context: industrial-scale cheese production. The instinct to dismiss this as trivial reflects a misunderstanding of what cheese fundamentally represents. It is not merely a food product. It is a preservation technology, a method of converting highly perishable protein and fat into a calorically dense, shelf-stable form that can sustain communities through extended periods without refrigeration or reliable food production. Wisconsin produces more cheese than any other state in the nation, and the knowledge embedded in that industry, the precise understanding of fermentation timing, temperature management during aging, moisture control, cold storage optimization, is exactly the category of distributed, low-technology food security expertise that nuclear winter conditions demand. This expertise cannot be acquired from instructional materials after infrastructure has failed. It must already exist in the practiced hands of people who have performed these processes repeatedly over years and decades. In Wisconsin, it does. The state's freshwater geography reinforces this foundation substantially. Lake Michigan borders the east. Lake Superior borders the north. The Wisconsin River system threads through the interior. This combination provides water security at a level that most inland states cannot approach. Population density decreases markedly north of Green Bay, creating the spatial buffer that allows communities the time and room to adapt, rather than being overwhelmed by the pace of deterioration. Wisconsin's northern forests provide fuel wood sufficient to heat communities through winters, potentially far more severe than any in recorded history. The state provides clear, defensible answers to the three fundamental questions that ultimately determine whether a community endures a multi-year survival scenario. What is the food source? What is the water source? How is warmth maintained? Wisconsin addresses all three without requiring optimistic assumptions or untested contingency plans. Wyoming. Wyoming's population stands at approximately 580,000 residents, making it the least populous state in the nation. That single demographic fact alters the survival calculus more profoundly than almost any other individual variable. Fewer people in relation to available land and resources translates directly into reduced competition, slower institutional breakdown, extended organizational timelines, and a realistic proportionality between what the local environment can produce under degraded conditions and what the resident population actually requires to sustain itself. Wyoming's combined ranching and agricultural capacity could plausibly support its current population even under substantially diminished growing conditions. That statement cannot credibly be made about California, Texas, Florida, New York, or any other high-population state, where the disparity between local production capacity and local consumption demand is so vast that no realistic adaptation pathway closes the gap quickly enough. Consider a working ranch outside Cody during the second year of nuclear winter. The overcast persists. The growing season has contracted to its shortest observed duration, but the cattle herd remains. The horses remain. The well draws clean water from the Wind River Basin aquifer. The rancher and the next generation perform the same work their predecessors performed, managing land and livestock through direct physical effort, without dependence on systems that require a functioning national infrastructure behind them. That operational model is not sentimentality. Under nuclear winter conditions, it constitutes the most reliable blueprint for sustained human survival currently available. Wyoming's vast public lands also offer something that densely settled states cannot: room for managed wildlife harvesting as a supplementary food source. Elk, mule deer, pronghorn, and other large ungulates exist in populations sufficient to provide meaningful caloric contribution to a small resident human population, particularly during the critical early phase of nuclear winter when agricultural adaptation is still underway. The state's established hunting culture means this capacity is not hypothetical. It is exercised annually by a significant fraction of the population, with associated skills in field dressing, meat preservation through smoking and drying, and hide processing for cold weather clothing production. Wyoming's energy production profile adds a further dimension. As one of the leading energy-producing states with substantial coal reserves, natural gas extraction infrastructure, and expanding wind generation capacity, Wyoming retains the potential for meaningful local power generation even after a national grid failure. The practical skills that mechanization and automation have rendered obsolete across most of the country remain alive in Wyoming and are actively practiced by individuals who chose to maintain them. In the initial years following a nuclear exchange, the most consequential human assets will not be those possessing the most advanced technology. They will be those who retain the competence to function productively without it. If you've made it this far, you're clearly taking this seriously. A like, comment, or subscribe is the best way to support this kind of content and help it find others who need it. Oregon, the Pacific Northwest variable. Most assessments of post-nuclear geography overlook the Pacific Northwest entirely, often because of the assumed vulnerability of the Portland-Seattle corridor. That dismissal is overly broad. Eastern and southern Oregon present a markedly different profile. The Willamette Valley, despite its proximity to Portland, contains some of the most fertile and diverse agricultural land in North America, capable of supporting an unusually wide range of crop varieties. More importantly, southern and central Oregon offer low population density, substantial timber resources for fuel and construction, significant freshwater from the Cascade snowpack and numerous river systems, and a mild enough baseline climate that even nuclear winter cooling would leave growing conditions within a survivable range. Oregon also benefits from a deeply established culture of small-scale sustainable agriculture, including organic farming cooperatives, seed-saving networks, and community-supported agriculture operations. These are not hobbyist enterprises. They represent exactly the distributed, low-input food production model that a post-exchange environment demands. The knowledge of how to produce food without industrial fertilizers, mechanized harvesting, or centralized distribution is not theoretical in Oregon. It is actively practiced at a scale sufficient to matter. Oregon's geographic diversity also provides an unusual degree of agricultural flexibility. The state spans arid high desert in the east, temperate rainforest conditions in the west, and a range of microclimates in between. This variation means that as nuclear winter shifts temperature bands and precipitation patterns, some portion of the state's agricultural land is likely to remain within a productive range even as conditions deteriorate elsewhere. A state with only one climatic zone faces a binary outcome. Either conditions remain viable or they do not. A state with multiple zones retains options, and options are the foundation of adaptive strategy. The Pacific fisheries add another layer. While oceanic contamination is a legitimate concern in a post-exchange scenario, cold water species in Oregon's extensive river systems, particularly salmon and steelhead, represent a significant supplementary protein source. Coastal communities with established fishing infrastructure and preserved traditional knowledge of smoking, drying, and fermenting fish possess food preservation capabilities that align precisely with the demands of a prolonged period without refrigeration. Vermont. The quiet advantage Vermont rarely appears in these discussions, and that absence itself may be one of its advantages. With a population of approximately 650,000 and a land area dominated by forest, small-scale dairy farms, and distributed agricultural communities, Vermont presents an exceptionally favorable ratio of local production capacity to resident population. The state's agricultural character is defined by small, diversified farms rather than industrial monoculture. This is precisely the model that survives the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial food system with the least disruption. Vermont farmers, by and large, already operate at scales and with methods that do not assume unlimited fossil fuel inputs, synthetic fertilizer availability, or national distribution networks. The transition that would devastate industrialized agricultural states is, for many Vermont operations, a modest intensification of existing practice. Vermont's maple sugar industry represents an often overlooked caloric resource. Sugar production from maple sap requires no imported inputs, operates on renewable biological cycles, and produces a calorically dense, shelf-stable product using only fire and simple evaporation equipment. In a world without refined sugar imports, regional maple production becomes a significant nutritional asset. Freshwater access is abundant through Lake Champlain and the state's extensive river networks, including the Lamoille, Winooski, and Otter Creek systems. The state's heavily forested landscape, which covers approximately 75% of its total area, provides fuel wood at volumes sufficient for indefinite heating requirements. A critical consideration, given that nuclear winter projections suggest winters extending well beyond normal duration and severity. Vermont's strong tradition of town meeting governance, mutual aid networks, and community self-organization provides exactly the social infrastructure that holds communities together when formal institutions cease to function. The town meeting model is not ceremonial in Vermont. It is the actual mechanism through which many communities make binding decisions about resource allocation, infrastructure maintenance, and collective priorities. That practice of direct, democratic participation, of citizens sitting in a room and arriving at decisions together, builds exactly the organizational muscle that a post-collapse community needs to govern itself when county, state, and federal authorities are no longer operational. Communities that have practiced self-governance do it naturally under pressure. Communities that have never done it face a governance vacuum at the precise moment when coordinated decision-making is most critical. Vermont's relatively isolated geographic position also provides a degree of insulation from the mass migration pressures that would overwhelm states located along major interstate corridors or adjacent to large metropolitan areas. The state's road infrastructure, while adequate for its resident population, does not facilitate rapid, large-scale movement in the way that the interstate highway system serving more centrally located states does. In a collapse scenario, this limited accessibility functions as a natural buffer, slowing the rate at which external population pressure reaches established communities. What this means practically. The purpose of this assessment is not to induce relocation decisions made under anxiety. Geographic positioning is one variable among many, and arguably not the most important one for the majority of individuals. 3 practical actions carry significant value, regardless of current location. Water independence. Identify the nearest non-municipal freshwater source within reasonable distance of your residence. Acquire and maintain adequate filtration capability. Maintain stored water reserves that exceed your initial estimate of sufficiency. The standard recommendation of 72 hours of supply reflects planning for temporary service interruptions, not systemic infrastructure failure. Adjust accordingly.